And we'll keep it with the number crunching. And the government will, in the course of the next financial year, sell its long overdue $1 billion sovereign bond to fund the ambitious 1.6 trillion shilling budget. Cabinet Secretary Henry Rotich said this soon after reading his budget statement. Adelaide Changole attended the post-budget briefing at Treasury and brings us the highlights.
Kenya's large debt levels continue to be a concern, especially with a budget to the tune of 1.6 trillion shillings. Public opinion continues to shed light that this will tip the public debt into the unsustainable realm. But the Treasury Secretary has come out to reassure Kenyans that the government will be keeping an eye on the debt burden to ensure they remain sustainable.
We have made it in a way that the borrowing is sustainable. And there's no cause of alarm in terms of our debt.
Speaking after unveiling the historic budget, the National Treasury head told journalists that the government was already working on a plan to launch a sovereign bond in the course of the year to finance energy, roads and railway projects, in addition to funding the completion of the Lamu port. He said the time was right for the Eurobond, given the low interest rates currently available in the global market.
There is also a lot of opportunity now in the global financial markets. The interest rates are quite low, as you are aware, and a lot of funding are looking for, opportunities, especially in Africa.
According to Rotich, the government also plans to reduce its dependence on domestic debt by cutting the target for domestic borrowing from 165 billion shillings in the last financial year to 106 billion in this financial year. This would ensure local farms have access to funds and inflation rate is kept low. The government will also scale up taxes so as to shore up its revenues. Key among this is a retabling of the contentious VAT bill.
The VAT bill that we currently have was a bill of 1989. It even came up during the period of price controls, and it worked well during price controls. They have been, lobbying to get, items to be exempted. Our VAT design is already a bad one, and so that's why we really want to replace.
Analysts contend that the country lost 50 billion shillings in the last year because the bill was not published. The government also plans to introduce a 1.5% levy on all imports to fund railway development, a factor that is likely to revive debate on the high cost of living currently beyond the reach of many. Adelaide Changole, KTN Business Today.
Thanks, Adelaide. Now let's take a look at the budgets from the rest of the East African countries. And we all know East Africa has had quite an ambitious budget for the financial year 2013-2014. And let's start with Kenya right here, 1.6 trillion shillings. That's about 20 billion US dollars. And for Tanzania, it was 16.7 trillion Tanzania shillings, which amounts to about 10 billion US dollars. Let's move on now to the other countries. And Uganda has had a 12 trillion Uganda shillings budget, and that's about 4.6 billion US dollars. And Rwanda, of course, had the list with about 2.5 billion US dollars, translating into 1.6 trillion Rwanda francs. And if we look at how much of this budget or of these budgets these countries are meant to fully fund themselves or by themselves, we look at Kenya, which is meant to fund about 90% of the entire 1.6 trillion budget. Uganda will fund 75% of the budget after donor aid was cut last year, of course, by the biggest funders, that was World Bank. And Rwanda as well will be funding 60.2% of the entire budget, and Tanzania will fund 70% of the total budget. Let's move on now and take a look at the key sectors for these countries. And if we're going to take a look at Uganda, Uganda is actually going through quite some tough times, especially now that donor aid was cut. Ugandans will have to incur taxes, special tax on the processed milk and fish exports, and also a VAT on domestic water supply. We'll also see additional 50 shilling on excise duty on fuel. That is among other taxes that Ugandans will have to incur. And also, let's take a look at Rwanda. And Rwanda's budget, 60.2% percent of the entire budget is basically meant on implementing the second phase of economic development and poverty eradication that is in line or in tandem with Vision 2020 of Rwanda. Let's move on now to Tanzania. And Tanzania's budget basically looks at about 18.3 billion shillings for domestic and foreign sources that the government is meant to raise, and also 11.1 billion that it's meant to raise as tax and non-tax revenue, which will actually accommodate about 20.2 2% of the gross domestic product. And that is just about the highlights of the entire East African budgets for the 4 countries. Of course, Burundi was not part of the budget reading just because they haven't yet conformed to the East African Constitution.